These are the biggest videos that we do every offseason. Months of research, staring at computers, compiling numbers, and making our opinions on players from last season and what we think they're going to do in 2024. Today is the official start of must-have season. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today's video are my top 3 must-have running backs that when I do my drafts, I want to make sure that I leave with no matter what. And the best part about these running backs is at their current ADP, you could leave your draft with all 3 of them. Now, this information is good for any type of league that you play in. Redraft, best ball, dynasty, it doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you why these 3 running backs are guys that I'm investing in for 2024. But one quick disclaimer, I am going to be using Underdog's ADP to discuss these players. Redraft ADP and best ball ADP can be a little bit different sometimes. So just keep in mind that the ADPs that I'm giving you today are from a best ball platform. They could adjust slightly, and if they do, we might have to maneuver some things around. But more than likely, you could still walk away with all 3 of these players. But if you want to try and take advantage of these players in best ball, you can do so right now over on Underdog. And if you've never played on their app before, now is the time to start using code word headliners. All you have to do is download their app, create a new account, and deposit at least $10 using code word headliners, and you're going to get our draft guide sent over to you for absolutely free. And on top of that, you're going to get a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, and you're going to nail a deposit bonus as well. So come draft against myself, Jake, other members of the Headliner team, and other members of Headliner Nation over on Underdog. Just get signed up right now. As I mentioned at the top of the video, all 3 of these guys could be had on your fantasy roster if you draft correctly this season. So I want to include one guy that you'll be picking early as your RB1. Then a guy that would be coming shortly after that is your RB2, and then a guy that you could draft a little bit later is your RB3. And if you manage to walk away from your drafts with these 3 guys, you can lock in quite a few championships. All right, my number 1 must-have running back this season, Breece Hall, currently the RB3 with an overall ADP of 8.1. Now, that ADP surely will change for redraft leagues, so just want to make sure that I note that right now. Breece Hall is likely going to be either a top 3 or 4 pick in redraft leagues, or potentially slipping to maybe 5 or 6. If you have a middle of the first round pick, you may get lucky, but more than likely you're going to need a top 4 pick to have a shot at Breece Hall this season. And last year turned out to be an extraordinary year for Breece Hall, especially considering the circumstances. Coming back from a knee injury that he had in 2022 during his rookie season, and an extremely poor offense with a bad offensive line that couldn't do anything through the air, and Breece Hall was still heads above the rest of the pack at the running back position. He was 14th in rushing attempts last year with 222, and then he ended up finishing 13th in rushing yards, just barely missing out 1,000 for the season. And he showed a lot of that explosiveness and big playability from his rookie season, something that's hard to do when you're working your way back from a knee injury. But he had 4 attempts last season of 40 or more rushing yards, good for 2nd most in the league. On top of that, 402 big play yards. Now, big play yards are yards that were gained on runs of 15 or more yards. 402 of those yards, which was good for 4th among running backs. Now, his rushing touchdowns were tough to come by last season, tied for 21st. And a lot of times the reason for that is that the New York Jets drives just stalled out. They were never really close enough to the red zone to give Breece Hall many more opportunities. Breece Hall was also a beast in the passing game last season, leading all running backs in the trifecta. 1st in targets, 1st in receptions, and 1st in receiving yards. Now, his 4 receiving touchdowns were tied for 3rd among running backs, so at least we saw him scoring through the air. But then you take a look at his efficiency. Now, we talked about it with the big play yards. His explosiveness and his efficiency last season were incredible, especially considering the fact he was coming back from a major knee injury. A lot of times running backs in that situation take a little bit of time to get that explosiveness back. back. We saw it with a guy like Javonte Williams. He was hyper efficient when he entered the league his rookie year. And then in his second year, he had that knee injury towards the beginning of the season. And then last year in year 3, he just didn't have the same pop that he had when he was a rookie. His worst efficiency category was yards per attempt, where he ended up ranking 11th. But in yards after contact per attempt, he was second. And in avoided tackles per attempt, he ended up tying for 5th. And even from a perspective of fantasy points, he ended up tying for 3rd in fantasy points per snap, and he was 4th in fantasy points per touch. Not only did he have the volume last year, but he got his efficiency and explosiveness back a lot earlier than intended. And with having Aaron Rodgers back this season and hopefully the offense being way better, the sky could be the limit for Breece Hall. It's also crazy to think about it from a perspective of last season to begin the year, Breece Hall's workload was being monitored. He was only averaging 11 carries per week last season from weeks 1 through 6 prior to their bye in week 7. He was only the RB16 in fantasy points. But when they came back from their bye in week 7, from weeks 8 through 18, Breece Hall started averaging 14 carries per game. And during that time span, he was the RB2. We saw a huge increase in his ceiling towards the end of last year when he started to gain more and more confidence, was more and more healthy, and the Jets finally started to unleash him a little bit more. And now with Aaron Rodgers back at the helm at quarterback, hopefully healthy, making Garrett Wilson a big-time weapon there, and some of the other weapons they have as well, Breece Hall, who had great efficiency last season with a poor offense and poor offensive line, will see that same efficiency, maybe some more touches, and another really big, more consistent season incoming. On to my second must-have running back, currently coming in with an ADP of 30.1, the RB9 off the board, Derrick Henry. And just like with Breece Hall, we're going to have to monitor that ADP because I do believe that ends up creeping into the second round for redraft leagues instead of the third round for best ball leagues. I really don't anticipate the RB9 going until the third round with a redraft league. But that doesn't mean that his ADP still won't put him comfortably back towards the end of the second round. Meaning if you decide to go with a heavy running back approach this year, which I'm always for, you could end up getting Breece Hall at the beginning of the first, and then you could get Derrick Henry at the end of the second. And if you're thinking to yourself, it's really hard for me to go with 2 running backs in the first 2 rounds because what am I going to do at wide receiver 1? There could end up being some pretty good options at the beginning of the third. Because like I just mentioned, if some of the running backs end up bumping up into the end of the second round, that means some of the wide receivers are going to have to fall a little bit. You could end up grabbing a guy at the beginning of the third round like Mike Evans, Michael Pittman Jr., Cooper Kupp. There's a few guys going right in that area that if you took them as your wide receiver 1, you probably are still going to fare pretty well as long as you find good value with wide receiver the rest of the way. Derrick Henry is coming off of another superb season in 2023, but to me it feels like people just talk about how he's lost a step. He led the league last season with 280 rushing attempts, and he ended up being second in the league with 1,167 rushing yards. But the big plays didn't escape Derrick Henry last season. He ended up having 2 runs of 40 or more yards, and the big play yards were there as well. He ended up being 5th with 385 big play yards, which once again are yards that come on runs of 15 or more yards. His 12 rushing touchdowns also tied him for 5th in the league. And his efficiency wasn't awful last season, but it was a little bit lower than what we are used to. Now, people might be saying that's why they think he's losing a step, but is it because Derrick Henry's losing a step? He got plenty of enough volume last year and stayed healthy, or is it the fact that his offense lost a step and was just that bad? Now, Derrick Henry did have his second lowest yards per attempt and yards after contact per attempt of his career. But weird, because his 0.21 avoided tackles per attempt was 6th most in the league and the second highest number for his career. From a per snap basis, Derrick Henry's still very good. Ended up tying for 3rd in fantasy points per snap last season. Unfortunately, though, because he didn't have some of the high ceiling that we're used to, he ended up tying for 19th in fantasy points per touch. Now, we all know Derrick Henry can be an absolute beast. And once again, I've already kind of explained to you that if you think he's losing a step, it wasn't him. It was his offense last season. And now he's going to be moving into an offense with a better offensive line, a better passing attack, and a mentality of we're going to run the football at you regardless of who we have in our backfield. Because last season, their backfield was not very good and they still put up fantastic numbers. If you take all the numbers of Gus Edwards, Justice Hill, Keaton Mitchell, Melvin Gordon, and J.K. Dobbins, and you add them together, they had a fantastic season. They had 363 attempts combined last year. They had 1,696 rushing yards, averaging 4.67 yards per attempt, and scoring 20 touchdowns. If you take a look at these numbers from an overall perspective, they are fantastic. And Derrick Henry will be the main guy this season, and I wouldn't be shocked if he sees more than 70% of the RB touches. It was already announced Keaton Mitchell is starting on the PUP list. And do we think Justice Hill is really going to steal a bunch of carries from Derrick Henry? What if we decide to say that we leave Derrick Henry's carries right around 280 for a season? He doesn't get a huge bump from what he did last year. The volume that we got used to in Tennessee is a little bit lower. That's fine. 4.67 yards per carry by this group of running backs last season. Do we not think that Derrick Henry can do at least that, if not better? Heck, even if he does 4.5 yards per carry, he's still running for well over 1,000 yards. 20 rushing touchdowns? They gave the ball to Gus Edwards as much as they possibly could at the goal line last season. Do we not think that at least 15 rushing yards are within the realm of possibility for a healthy Derrick Henry? Just think about the massive upside your roster is going to have every single week with Breece Hall and Derrick Henry leading the way. All right, so now we've used our first pick and our second pick to establish some insane upside at the running back position to begin our roster. Now we use our third, fourth, and fifth round picks, maybe even sixth round, depending on the ADP. We'll talk about that in a second, for getting a couple of wide receivers. Maybe we take a stab at a tight end or a quarterback as well inside that time frame. But then we get into the sixth, possibly seventh round. And that is where our third running back comes into play. And my third must-have running back is David Montgomery from the Detroit Lions, with a current ADP of 75 overall and the RB 17 in drafts. Now, like I mentioned, redraft leagues are probably going to be a little bit different. David Montgomery in the 7th round would be absolutely crazy. So I'm excited to see where his ADP ends up landing during redraft season. So let's go ahead and talk about it in a manner of him probably being somewhere in the 6th round. We've got our high upside with our first two running backs. Now we need our really safe floor at the running back position. We've established our high upside, but David Montgomery, even with Jahmyr Gibbs, may be one of the safest running backs that you can invest in for 2024. Last season, he was top 10 in almost all of his volume categories, finishing tied for 15th in rushing attempts, but 9th in rushing yards. Then for his big play potential, he was tied for 4th on runs of 40 or more yards, but was a bit lower, being tied for 17th on his big play yards. But what he lacked in big plays, he made up for at the goal line, tying for 3rd last season in rushing touchdowns. Now, I feel like when people talk about David Montgomery, they see this volume-dependent, scoring-dependent running back, and that's not how it is. When you play in the offense like the Detroit Lions have, with the offensive line like they have, your opportunity to be efficient is big every single week. finishing 7th in yards per attempt, finishing 10th in yards after contact per attempt, and finishing tied for 7th in avoided tackles per attempt. Even his efficiency number for fantasy points was really good. He was 2nd in fantasy points per snap, and he was 10th in fantasy points per touch. But I know that there's going to be somebody in the comment section that makes an argument against David Montgomery because either the offense passes the ball so much or because they have Jahmyr Gibbs or whatever it may be. But Jahmyr Gibbs is no obstacle to fantasy points for David Montgomery. Last season, through the first 9 weeks of the year, both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs missed a couple of games. Then, from week 10 through week 18, they were on the field together the entire time. From week 10 through week 18, Jahmyr Gibbs showed us that upside. He was the RB6 during that time frame. David Montgomery was no slouch either, because during that time frame, he was the RB11. And even to add to all that information, think about an improved Detroit Lions defense. They have one of the biggest improved secondaries in all of football. And we know their defensive line was able to get after the quarterback with the best of them last season. Think about the Detroit Lions heading into the fourth quarter with some big leads and running the football and pounding it at their opponents with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Maybe David Montgomery isn't the RB11 this season, but there is absolutely no way that if this guy is healthy for even 15 games this season, that he doesn't finish inside the top 24 running backs. So now with Breece Hall and Derrick Henry, you have two guys that could be inside the top 5 running backs this season. Then you add in David Montgomery as your RB3, who should be locked inside the top 24, and you have yourself one of the best backfields in your league, and you're absolutely dismantling your opponents. Now, I had already finished recording the video and was editing it when I actually decided to come back and add this piece to the video. Because when I was editing and putting everything together to send to Taylor, I started to think about the ADPs that I gave you. And I thought to myself, there may be some people out there who hear these ADPs and there's like, no way that ends up happening. So I went and did a little bit of research to find out for redraft leagues exactly where guys are going. Now, it is a little on the early side for redraft ADP, so it could still end up changing. But as of right now, this is what we're seeing from either leagues that are drafting way too early or mock drafts. Going back to Breece Hall, we talked about the fact that he wasn't going to be going towards the end of the first round, which is where he's at in underdog right now. So taking a look at it, his current redraft ADP has him going above Bijan Robinson, but exactly where I told you I thought he would be going. Right now, he's going anywhere from pick 5 to pick 6. Derrick Henry's overall ADP is almost spot on. Right now, as a reminder, over on Underdog, he's going around 30.1. On redraft platforms, though, he's averaging about 27.3 overall. The biggest difference here, though, and it's not that big of a difference, in redraft leagues, he's actually the RB10 instead of the RB9 like he is over on Underdog. David Montgomery overall has the same exact ADP. His overall ADP on Underdog is 75, and his overall ADP right now for redraft leagues is also 75. The biggest difference, though, in best ball leagues over on Underdog, he's going as the RB17. In redraft leagues, he's going as the RB22. How in the world is David Montgomery being drafted lower in regular redraft leagues than he is on best ball leagues? That's absolutely insane, but I wanted to add that information here at the end of the video, just in case we did get some of those comments. I could point you in the direction of this information, and you could see that as of right now, the ADPs are fairly close. Things will change a little bit when we get closer to redraft season, but at least as of right now, we're kind of on the same thought process. Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for my video today. If this doesn't convince you to invest in Breece Hall, Derrick Henry, and David Montgomery, I don't know what will. And once again, the best part about this is you can walk away from your redraft teams adding all 3 of these running backs and potentially having the best core of running backs of anyone in your fantasy league. If you appreciate and enjoy our content, make sure you hit the like button for me And also on your way out, if you're new here, do not forget to subscribe and turn the bell notifications on. So anytime we have new content come out, you're going to know about it right away. And if you missed any of our recent videos, YouTube is going to recommend one of those to you right now. Make sure you click on it when this video is done. But for now, Headliner Nation, peace out, stay safe, and stay healthy. And I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics.